Hi, everybody. So just a reminder, the next couple of lectures are going to include content that can be triggering for some individuals. We are going to discuss sex work. We're going to discuss human trafficking. We're going to discuss sexual violence, physical violence, assault. The next few chapters are going to be rough. So I just want you to take care of yourself and make sure that if you are watching this, you're doing so in a space that you feel safe in and that has safe people around you. Again, this is also not content that you should be listening to around kids. So if you're parents, this might be one for the earphones. Let me know if you guys need any help. Remember that there's also a resource page on the end of the slides, and there's a resource, even more resources listed in your EKU resource handbook, or not handbook, resource list that is in the syllabus section. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Let me share my screen. We're going to start with chapter 12. And so again, here's your content notes. I just want to make sure that we're paying attention to that and being mindful of ourselves so that we can hopefully not make the situation any worse than it has to be. All right, so first I want to make a differential between sex work and human trafficking. This is an important differential because as we start to talk about things, we're going to kind of talk about how consent gets muddy, and the big core difference here being that sex work is something that is done consensually, that is something that is done as a profession or temporarily, depending on the person, but it is something that is done due to a wide variety of reasons, but with the consent of the human that is partaking in those situations. Human trafficking, on the other hand, does not have consent or is using individuals within that sex work market that cannot consent. So these can include people that have medical ailments that make them incapable. These are those who are considered heavily under the influence. These are children under the age of 18 and or specifically minors, because it gets also a little wonky with age when you start talking about child marriage. And we'll talk about that a little more in a little bit. But just a reminder that legally you cannot consent. At a federal level, consent cannot be acquired when someone is unconscious with specific medical ailments that make them incapable of either emotionally or verbally consenting. This does not mean that if you cannot speak, you cannot give consent. You can. It's just obviously done in the language that you ascribe to or how you communicate. And then also if you are underage. So those are the big key points. And again, we'll talk about the muddiness of consent as we kind of work through this chapter, because that's where a lot of the legality and social issues come into play. Also, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that I'm wearing teal and will be consistently through these along with some purple because they are the colors for sexual assault awareness and domestic violence awareness. So just so you know, that was intentional, as is most of the coloring on the slides and things of that nature. So real quick, here's some definitions for the commercial sex industry. For pornography, I do want to classify that revenge porn isn't always something that is work. It's not always something that is paid for. It's not always something that is considered part of sex work, but it can be. And so, like when you see celebrities that have their sex tapes leaked by exes intentionally to create some kind of economic gain, that would be considered in that realm. However, legalities entered to that are very, very icky, and those things can come back to, again, bite that person in the butt. And it is ethically not a good idea to use any kind of sext that is forwarded to you as a part of an interdynamic relationship, be sent to someone else or be used as to hold that person emotionally hostage or in any way blackmail. So you also have cyber sex, which is, again, this doesn't always have to be sex work. Cyber sex can also include any kind of sexting you do over webcams with your partner. It can include any kind of sex that happens within video games. There are things that you can do and devices you can now plug into computers that can allow the person on the other end to, I guess, do some kind of sexual act with you through the items that you plug into the computer. So there's many forms of cyber sex, and not all of them are sex work, because not all of them are in exchange for any kind of monetary or resource value. Again, so a sex worker. Okay, so here's a big key thing. The term prostitute has been considered or deemed, for the most part, a slur within the sex worker community and within those movements. And so the word sex worker, again, is trying to emphasize that point, that it is legitimate work and that it does humanize the issue to where these are workers that have rights and deserve respect and deserve fair treatment of the law when they have violence done to them. And it is trying to drive away from that social negative implication that the word prostitute generally is attached to. So there's that. And again, sexting comes back into that same category of, it's not always sex work, but it can be. There are plenty of companies and plenty of online platforms that can put you in conversations with, either via phone or via text, that have these services that are provided at a monetary rate. Human trafficking, again, gets into that idea where consent is not part of the equation, and or there is some kind of coercion, some kind of underage issue, some kind of crossing or migration things, or there are specific resources like crossing the border that are attached to it and used as means to keep someone in this kind of work. And that does not create consent. So again, you're going to have your anything that has to do with children, all of that's going to file under human trafficking, as that is a minor and therefore cannot legally consent. So there's that. And there is a lot of horrific statistics in here that I'm not going to get into, but they are in your book and they are there for you when you need it. And we'll get more into these things as we go. Sex trafficking is considered a modern form of slavery, as is human trafficking for any kind of domestic labor, any kind of mining, any kind of all sorts of other things. As part of, if you are living in Kentucky, as part of the Attorney General's office, they have a survivors council where many people who have experienced all sorts of different violences that have been done to them, everything from shootings all the way to human trafficking, get together and network to how to make survivors' lives better, how their legal process can get better, how their resources can get better, how we can just do better. I was part of the second one of those, and we worked towards the group that I primarily was part of, worked on how to make campuses safer and how to better train sexual assault prevention trainers within HR departments, within accommodations offices, and within our university police within Kentucky. So there is that resource. If there is someone that you know that is in need of something, that resource is actually incredibly valuable, and that network can link you into pretty much any kind of resource you might need for a person. And I know that all the information to contact whoever is currently in charge of that, because that changed when Beshear became the governor and our attorney general changed. And so I am not entirely sure who that person is, but I can get you in contact with that person if you need to. All right, we're going to move along from the definitions. And we're going to talk about porn for a little bit. I know, right? You thought you were going to be in a college class talking about porn, but we are. So we're going to talk a little bit about how technology changed the environment of how sex work was produced. Okay. For a long time prior to the internet, prior to really movies, most of any kind of pornography or any kind of explicit content you were going to get was in the way of pictures. Prior to pictures, you were going to have to physically contact or go to a brothel or to something like this. As technology has changed, we moved towards VHS, we moved towards movies, DVDs, those kinds of things. And then as the internet came along, websites were devoted towards this in particular. They created, it is considered legal and protected within the United States. So the porn industry is a legal industry, and it is something that has been legally challenged on a number of occasions. It has a negative, watching porn does have a negative correlation if you are in a long-term relationship. However, that being said, it doesn't have a correlation to any kind of like not being able to have a relationship or something of that nature. But if you are in one, it can have and has been shown to have a negative correlation for that relationship as a whole. There is a category of porn that is called feminist porn, and it's a genre of porn that explores alternative representations of beauty, desire, pleasure, power, and is committed to gender equality and social justice. It's an interesting dynamic, and it came out of this war that came within the feminist movement, where there was one side that was very much against porn, that saying that it was inherently sexist, it was inherently oppressive, it was a form of violence against women, and it was furthering the commodification of women's bodies and the objectivity and dehumanization. Now, again, there are things that work that way. Feminist porn was kind of but wait, this is also a freedom of expression of sexuality. This can also be a form of showing the world all the different ways in which people can love. It can show a different and queer way of gaining access to these kinds of ideas. And it also allowed for a space where there was different body types, different ethnicities, different kind of love, different kinds of porn. And those things, again, vary depending on where it is that is accessed and where it is that what it is that you might be accessing. Sex positive feminisms, again, we're in favor of porn, sexual freedom and consent, and that, again, denying women the right to be in that industry is yet another way in which we're demanding a woman to look, act, and express themselves in particular ways. And it, again, said that sex positive feminism could be an educational tool. Now, often that is not the case. Porn is not utilized as an educational tool in many ways. But it also can allow inclusive versions of sexual practices, which, again, we just talked about. However, there is a fraction of porn that almost all feminists and almost all groups will explicitly act out against and or talk about as an issue, and that is the violence that comes within porn. And if there is porn that is hyper aggressive and or showing any kind of lack of consent and or showing any kind of intentional harm of another human being, then that in and of itself becomes an issue. And it's complex because it doesn't necessarily mean that the people that are watching it it doesn't create them to be violent offenders. However, it also can affirm those ideologies if they already have them. So while we know that there are many people that watch this kind of porn that do not become violent offenders, on the flip side, we do know that most violent offenders can and have been affirmed by these particular types of porn. And so that in and of itself probably is the kind of porn that most people overarchingly are saying, hey, this kind of porn we need to kind of regulate, or maybe choose how we determine consent within these items. And then, okay, so when you're talking about porn and youth, most teenagers are going to access porn at some point in their life. That's just kind of a given at this point, and that's part of the technology shift and the shift in access to these kinds of imageries. And it can depict sex in very unrealistic and homogenizing ways. And in doing that, and the bodies that you see are very homogenized, very one-noted, very white, very very fit for the most part, and their ideas of sex, again, what happens in these videos are eroticized in a certain way for specifically white male gaze. And in doing that, it's not creating a realistic picture of what those interactions can be. So what happens is it creates uncertainty for future expectations in some, and in some it can display that violence and child sex acts as like this normative or this something that isn't inherently bad. And it can create a dynamic where when youth become sexually active, they understand sex in these racialized, gendered, aged, heteronormative ways, right? So they're going to think that sex is like what they're seeing on these things. Now, again, with the right kind of conversations, the right kind of sex ed, the right kind of video streamings, the right kind of things like attitudes towards these things, porn has been shown to not have negative impacts on teenagers and on long-term sexual encounters, as long as it has, again, that other form of information coming in as well to kind of get a framing for what this particular brand of media specifically looks like. Okay, so we're going to get into sex work, and then I will probably pause and we will go into the next video. But I want to get through this first. So sex work is kind of understand as this raced, classed, and gendered idea. And by that, we mean that you're going to predominantly see those with economic uncertainty engage in these behaviors or this particular profession. And because of that, we understand sex work to be one of those careers that comes out of limited opportunities, which does not make it inherently a wrong opportunity. It just means that with limited ways in which to financially support oneself, this can look like a consensual option that creates some kind of income that is sustainable. Most sex workers are women, and disproportionately they are women of color. Per capita, per population capita, trans women of color are actually the highest percentage of those who work in sex work. And again, we're going to kind of talk about that a little bit more when we get into the LGBT community and sex work when we get further into this lecture. But sex workers are often women from economically underprivileged and lack opportunities. Immigration status can also impact one's likelihood to engage in sex work because, again, it likely impacts their ability to get income in other ways. And so when you lack economic opportunities that are considered illegal under the table and or might pay a decent amount for an hour, would give you an opportunity to possibly house yourself, possibly feed your children, or get medicines that you need. And these kind of opportunities are found in sex work. So sex workers can find themselves engaging in work due to all of these things, which we just kind of ran over, but there is a significant list of reasons why someone would engage in sex work, and all of those reasons are legitimate and valid. Again, these are not homogenous stories, so you cannot look at any kind of sex worker and say that they fit a specific demographic, because you do see sex workers that come from all different backgrounds, come from all different ideologies, come from all different race, gender, any kind of identity, right? Men tend to engage in this line of work for less often and for less often and for less amount of time. So when they do engage in this work, it tends to be temporary, and it tends to be in order to get some kind of economic footing in which they can move on to other kinds of career pathways, which might include another kind of sex work like pornography, or it might end up in any kind of non-sex work based job. And again, the market for male sex workers tends to be far less than the market for female sex workers. Sex work is stratified from street work all the way to escort services and high-end escort services for traveling businessmen and wealthy. And so that can look incredibly different depending on what kind of sex work you engage in and what kind of sex work you are striving to become. Sex workers face increased risks of death, rape, sexual assault, physical assault, and PTSD, which again stems from this lack of ability to obtain or lack of ability to have that kind of legal cushion. If these things happen to them, there is a limited amount of ability to report, and that creates a dynamic where the power is not in the survivor's hands of any kind of violence that is done to them. Also, we have an immense amount of stereotypes and rape myths that are lined into this kind of work that makes it so that their cases are far less likely to be tried, that the DA is far less likely to pick them up, and that they are less likely to be believed by any kind of person in the social or in the justice avenue due to their status as doing something illegal or criminal in general. Primarily, it's men who buy sex, and they are considered John's clients, tricks. Those are kind of the terminology. Pimps, players, or business managers are the kinds of individuals that work essentially above the women. They are essentially the ones that control time, place, pay, and this is the most common form of sex work. They target young, vulnerable women to engage in sex work for them. Many pimps are abusive and can create forced and coercive situations that become trafficking situations. Because again, once that force, coercion, lack of consent is there, then you get into human trafficking, and we'll kind of get into that in a minute. There's the sex workers movement, and this really just talks about how it is the oldest female occupation. It is it's really consistent with the legal and social debate, and in that's main focus in the movement is to decriminalize sex work. And in doing that, they're going to create, which is in the next slide, but they're going to create much more safety for the women and much more ability to kind of have their own pathways and make their own pathways. This is an international and local movement efforts. I'm going to discuss this complex understanding of consent and choice. Some counties in Nevada are the only places in the US where sex work is legal. There's, I think, 4, I might be wrong on that number. It might have changed. There's groups fighting for international include, Sex Workers Unite, Coyote, which I cannot remember for the life of me what that acronym stands for right this second, Amnesty International, the Human Rights Watch, and the World Health Organization. By decriminalizing sex works, you will, the criminalization is used as an instrument of power and punishment for shame. And this is considered something that is consistently part of the conversation between law enforcement and sex workers. And so if we can decriminalize that, those interactions will happen less, and those violence that happen against them through this law enforcement agencies will happen less. It's not, okay, the way in which we criminalize this behavior is not equal for sex workers and those who pay for sex. Johns typically are let off. They typically don't have any charges. They're typically not considered engaging in a illegal act unless there is some kind of motive behind that. Very rarely do they get any kind of consequences. However, sex workers consistently get arrested, consistently find themselves on the other hand, on the other end of the negative harms of criminalization. They're not equal for, okay, I just talked about that. It creates unsafe working conditions. So if you have to hide in the dark alleys, if you have to be in spaces and have to consistently move, you lose the ability to create your own space and have your own backup and have your own ability to create safe spaces. It hides violence because you cannot be engaging in an illegal act in order to have criminal actions of violence that happens to you. It increases risks of police harm. It allows for more access to consent. Again, they're getting to control the environments in which this happens, in which case that those sex workers are going to inherently be more safe. It makes it a tax payable job. It decreases the risk of sexually transmitted diseases because, again, you have more consent, you have more control over the spaces you can be in, and you're going to be able to demand or create a market in which there is an understanding for keeping someone safe, including wearing condoms and things of that nature. It can leave the room for more focus on decreasing human trafficking and child sex slavery, because again, the criminalization of sex workers that are of age, that are legally consenting to these things, won't be taking up the time and resources of law enforcement that could be directed towards decreasing human trafficking and child sex slavery. And again, it reduces stigma and the increase of personal freedom. And it's led by those who engage in this work. So this is what sex workers are specifically asking for. And if we listen to them, we might be able to create an environment that is better for them. And so I'm going to go ahead and stop there, and then we'll come back in and we'll start talking about human trafficking and more of the ugly side of what can happen in the realm of commodification of sex.